On to transformers. So with neural networks, it is, again, a bit of an old technology. And so very, very few people now are using it, although some researchers still like to use neural networks just because they were kind of trained in that technology. But a lot of the field has now shifted primarily to transformers and large language models. And so we'll talk a little bit about how these work. So around 2020, there was a bit of a paradigm shift from neural networks to transformers. And so neural networks are generally very task specific. So if, for example, I train a neural network to solve pneumonia or diagnose pneumonia, all it can do is diagnose pneumonia. I cannot, for example, use it to solve math problems or to write an essay for me, right? It can only do that single task. These generally were smaller models. And so we had around 1 million to 1 billion weights, right? So, or parameters. So that is the coefficients attached to different factors, right? And so a lot smaller. They were a lot cheaper and required a lot less data to build. And so, for example, we would have 100 data points from patients, and you'd be able to train a neural network, right? You would only kind of cost around $50 to train one. So that's kind of the kind of ballpark that we're playing in. And it primarily used something called supervised learning, which is you need to have a bunch of data plus what the ground truth is. So for example, with that length of stay example, you have to have all that data you want to collect from patients and how long they actually stayed, because you need how long they actually stayed to train the model. If, for example, you're missing how long they stayed, it would not be possible to train that model. Now with transformers, they are domain specific. And so, for example, the large language models we have now are very good at language in general, right? It's an entire domain. Now, people have also trained transformers on different things. So people have tried, for example, building genetic models or protein models or DNA models, right? So you can actually train it not just on the English language, but on other different types of languages as well. For example, like biological things, right? They are a lot larger. So they're kind of on the kind of field of 1 billion to 1 trillion parameters. So they're a huge amount of weights in these models, right? And so as you can imagine, to kind of do calculations on them, they're very, very expensive to build and very expensive to run. And so, for example, like ChatGPT's first model, it cost them $1 billion to build it, right? Very, very expensive. It's kind of out of the realm of the vast majority of people and companies to build a large language model. Now, as you'll see, they're primarily unsupervised, okay? And it's kind of like a nifty trick, but unsupervised learning basically means that you do not need a correct answer to train these models, okay? So kind of very, very cool. And they're primarily trained on the internet, okay? And so they basically downloaded the whole corpus of the internet in order to train these models, okay? And that's kind of how they built these systems. All right, so how do transformers work? So transformers are essentially neural networks which have an additional capability, which we call attention, okay? So as I kind of mentioned before, neural networks based on the universal approximation theorem allows the ability to model any math relation you like, okay? So it's just a basic way to model any mathematical function, okay? So very, very good with numbers. But then you also add this functionality known as attention, which is it understands the surrounding context, okay? So that is the surrounding words around the question that you're trying to ask, okay? So it adds language capabilities through attention. In terms of weights, these weights allow you to modify and to model mathematic kind of phenomena, while these ones determine what the AI should be paying attention to. And so we'll show you what that looks like. Now, how attention works is it's based on this thing called word embeddings, which is we can have words and actually represent them as coordinates, okay? So it all kind of comes back down to math. Someone realized that when we use language, you can basically map it mathematically. So for example, the word man and woman has this mathematical connection here, and it's the same one as king and queen, okay? Or king and man has the same connection as queen and woman, okay? And you can basically map it based on a bunch of different variables. It could be that you have, things like living being, how feline this word is, right? Or how human this word is, or how much gender this word has. And so you can actually map it mathematically. And so this was a concept that was suggested in 2012. And it basically kind of represented different languages based on a set of coordinates. And so, as you can imagine, you can kind of take different concepts from the English language and see how related they are to each other in mathematical space. So for example, these words here, if you take a look at it, it kind of comes together, right? Things like bathroom, shower, toilet, right? Things like battery or charger or tool come together here, right? But are very far away from this. Things like, concrete and grass are by itself here. Things like, refrigerator and oven and microwave are together, right? So we have kind of this intuitive concept of how similar words can be or how related words are. Now, previously, what we kind of use in the language field was that these coordinates would be static or stable. So that is, it never changes, right? So for example, if we put the word bathroom here, it will forever stay there. And if we put the word toilet there, it will forever stay there as well. And what we essentially realized was that with these words here, it really depends on the different words that you're using around that word, right? So for example, the meaning of words change based on the surrounding words. So if, for example, I say to fly, it is very different to a fly, right? So this word to makes this a verb, while this word a makes this a noun. Okay, and they mean completely different things. Another example is turn on the light versus light on your feet versus light-hearted. So you see how the word light actually changes based on the words that I've used, right? If I ask you to turn on the light, this word light here means something very different to light on your feet or light-hearted, right? So the attention to the surrounding context matters a lot for language. And so this is another kind of example of how different words have changed in meaning over time. So when we took a look at the word apple in 1994, most people would associate it with things like pears and strawberries, right? But now in 2016 or 2026, if you say the word apple, more people are going to associate it with things like Google or phones or iPads or whatever it is, right? So the meaning of words also change over time. It's the same with Amazon. In 1993, it was related to things like jungles, but now it's related to shopping, right? Or Obama, he was a professor, now he's a president. And then Trump is the same as well, kind of real estate, and now he's kind of related to a bunch of political words. Okay, so the meaning of words actually change over time too. Now, how attention works is that it starts with a static word embedding. So every word has some kind of coordinate in space related to other words. It then examines the surrounding words. It identifies words which influence its meaning, and then it updates the coordinates. Okay, so I have kind of a visual example of this. So say we have the word rabbit here. It will actually look at the sentence this word is in, so the rabbit quickly hopped, and then actually modify the meaning of rabbit based on the words around it. Say we have the word light. So say light is here in coordinate space. Depending on the sentence that it's in, it will actually modify its meaning. So say we have the words or the sentence turn on the light. It will detect that this word light is within this sentence and then modify the meaning of the word light. Okay, so it's able to deal with how words are actually represented in different sentences. Okay? If we have the kind of phrase light on your feet, it will detect this and then it will pull the meaning of the word down. Okay? So this is the only kind of change that we needed in order to deal with language. And it's quite a simple one, right? It just basically pays attention to the different words that is around kind of the main word. Okay? Now, any questions before we move on? So attention is kind of like a key concept as to how we've dealt with language. Questions? No? Okay. Now, this transformer architecture is essentially a bunch of neural networks with the concept of attention. Okay, so we've simply just added the ability of these neural networks to deal with attention. Now, how do we actually train these large language models? So it is a 5-step process, and so we'll go through each one. The first step is something called pre-processing, which is that transformers don't accept words as inputs, but rather they accept this thing called tokens. And what tokens are are basically subwords. So for example, we might have the word playing, that's going to be broken up into play and ing, right? We might have the word toothpaste, it's going to be broken up into tooth and paste. And we might have the word unfair, it's going to be broken up unfair. And so how tokens work is that it basically sees these words as separate concepts, okay? And the reason why, as you might imagine, is that something like play and ing, the fact that you see ing means that this becomes a verb, right? So it completely changes the meaning of the word play, right? If you see it by itself. If, for example, you might see the word fair, you know that is going to opposite the meaning of that word. Okay, so it's kind of an easier way for the AI to understand how these different language concepts interact with each other. Now, how we do so is something through a method called byte pair encoding, which is essentially having a bunch of different words split together into individual characters, and then seeing which characters are likely to end up together, just through language. And so, for example, E and S might be a kind of language construct where these letters often come together, and then it might, for example, become EST. And so if you kind of do this over a wide variety of words, eventually different language structures will emerge from that vocabulary. And so you might eventually see that U and N often come together to mean that the meaning of the word is flipped. You might, for example, see that ing is another language structure that often comes together. And so if you kind of apply that method, you start to see patterns in how words operate. Right? So for example, ing or un often have a certain meaning behind it. So if you take a look at this tokenizer kind of tool that OpenAI provides, you can actually see how AI sees different things, right? So we might read this in a very different way to how AI reads it. For example, AI might see kind of full stops by itself there. It might see dates very differently. So for example, like 8th and 9th, it will see the TH different to the 8 and the 9, right? It will also see, for example, things like commas just by itself, as well as different punctuation as well. And so the kind of concept behind how tokens work is that it will see different words based on kind of substructures of that word. All right, step 2 is pre-training. So after you have a bunch of tokens, you randomly initialize a transformer structure, and then you systematically mask words on a massive corpus of unlabeled data and ask it to predict. And so, for example, there are basically 2 different structures to how transformers can work. One is that you can mask, for example, I am a virtual assistant. You can mask different words inside the sentence, and then ask the AI to predict what that word is, right? Or you can ask the AI to complete the sentence, right? So I am a virtual, and then you mask that word. And so if you use the internet, because it's already written, you know what these words are, right? So you just basically mask at scale what different words are. And so this leads to do 2 different architectures on AI. The first is something called BERT. And so BERT uses a masked language modeling structure, which is it masks different words at random and then asks the AI to predict what that word is. The other type of structure is something called GPT. And so this is what the namesake of ChatGPT is. You basically mask words only in a single direction, and then you ask the AI to predict what that next word is. So for example, you might mask this entire sentence here, and then ask AI to predict what that next word is, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one. So you see how AI eventually learns to only complete the existing sentence, right? And so that was a very powerful technique in order to build ChatGPT. The kind of loss function that people now use for AI is a much more complex one called perplexity, right? So we've moved on from mean squared error to use perplexity. And how perplexity works is that it captures the uncertainty a model has in predicting the next word, right? And so a high perplexity is considered bad, while low perplexity is considered good. So for example, say we have the sentence, the boy went to the something. It will provide a bunch of predictions based on what it thinks the next word should be. right? So for example, it might predict with 10% probability that the next word will be cafe, 5% probability that the next word will be hospital, 40% playground, 15% park, and 30% school. So if, for example, on the internet data that we use to train, we see this sentence, the boy went to the playground, perplexity will be considered low because playground was predicted. If, for example, instead we see the boy went to the kindergarten, perplexity will be high because it wasn't even an option. Does that make sense? So how perplexity works is it basically predicts what the next word should be, and if it guesses wrong, then it will use that as a loss function to correct itself, right? And if it is correct, so for example, the word playground comes up, then it knows that it was guessing correctly what that next word should be. And so if you kind of do that at scale over the whole internet, eventually you get very complex behavior because it can predict what the likely next word is to be, okay, over kind of a huge amount of training data. All right, now step 3, fine-tuning. So once we have trained a bunch of transformers to spit out a bunch of kind of words based on a prompt, what happens is that it isn't very useful. So say, for example, if we haven't actually trained a model, so we've just trained it merely on kind of word prediction, if you ask it to explain the moon landing to a 6-year-old in a few sentences, it will just basically spit out what it sees on the internet. Okay, so it could spit out kind of different types of sentences it's seen. It's kind of very random. Another thing that you see is something called internet dreams, which is it just spits out things that it sees on the internet. So if, for example, you ask it for a Java code kind of example, it spits out something that is very nonsensical. For example, if you ask it for, kind of an Amazon thing, then it spits out like a random review. And same with a Wikipedia article as well. So what you need to do is a step called instruction fine-tuning, which is that you actually need to ask a bunch of humans to write instruction and output pairs. So that is a question that a human would plausibly ask, and then an answer that an AI should actually reply with. And then when you have 100,000 of these, you basically train the AI model to be able to answer in an effective way. And so they had to use this in such a way that they asked humans to write a lot of these and then train the AI to be able to answer in an assistant model. Now, the kind of limitations of this is that it's very expensive. It's very kind of open-ended, and so therefore it can add to that expense. And it's not always aligned with human preferences. And so the kind of initial training of this was very challenging because they had to get lots and lots of examples from lots of different people in order to train the AI to be useful. Step 4 is something called alignment, which is if you've used ChatGPT enough, and I was talking about this before, you will hopefully see kind of this pop up. And this usually pops up when the AI model is not sure how to answer something, right? And so it wants feedback from the user in order to decide which one is the better answer and how to kind of learn for future iterations, right? And so how they kind of did this initially is that they asked humans to choose a bunch of preferred answers over 50,000 of these samples. And then they eventually trained the model to write in a way that is pleasing to humans, right? Kind of pleasant to humans. As you might be kind of aware, this can be very expensive and tricky because kind of building this can be very expensive for the AI because it has to spit out 2 different answers. And so it kind of only does this when it is unsure how to answer something. Now, there's been a couple of tricks. People have realized that this is actually just a machine kind of learning neural network technique. And so people have optimized it instead of using reinforcement learning to use kind of just basic neural network techniques. And so it's some of the kind of principles of neural networks coming back into training these AI models. Step 5 is inference. So once you've trained a model, you just simply need to run it. And it's very straightforward. So as you'll see, when we use AI models, you essentially have a giant kind of file of parameters if you're kind of using an open source model. And it only requires about 500 lines to run it. So it's very simple once you have a model to run it, and it can be quite cheap. Now, we'll cover a little bit more about reasoning tomorrow. But how reasoning works is that you essentially explain to the AI how to reason through a problem, and then it learns from that example in order to reason a lot better. And so, for example, we have this kind of basic math problem here. If you just simply ask the AI, it gets it wrong. But if you explain your reasoning, so you see here, instead of saying the answer is 11, you actually explain how you got to the answer, then it will be able to actually reason using the same technique. So it learns from the answers that you provide in order to reason through in the exact same way. Okay? So once people realized that, they basically expanded that at scale. And then you have lots of different ways that the AI model can eventually reason because it's been trained on lots of reasoning paths, right? So how they kind of did that was they took probably like about 100,000 or a million reasoning problems, asked people to actually, lots of people to reason through those problems in different ways, and then train the AI kind of generally across all different ways that you could reason through a broad range of problems. And so reasoning has become very powerful because as an AI model reasons more, it actually gets better and better. So the more that an AI model actually thinks about a problem, it actually does better. Okay, so if you want to learn more about how to build things like transformers, these are two great videos in order for you to learn how to. So you can just search Let's Build GPT from Scratch. And Andrej Karpathy, who's the CTO of Tesla, will teach you how to build a transformers from scratch, as well as how to reproduce something like GPT-2. So these are great videos to learn more. Okay, so we've actually covered quite a lot today. So we've covered the history of AI. We've covered neural networks and deep learning, as well as transformers and large language models. And I'm happy to take any questions. So I kind of realized that this was potentially a very challenging kind of thing to learn, but happy to talk through more about anything that you might have questions on. Okay, yeah.
Kind of going back to when you talked about tokenization.
Yeah.
What is the functionality of AI breaking it down into its chunks? Is it just like how AI processes the information, or is it actually a function behind it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I might go back a few slides there. Yeah, so one of the kind of main reasons why is that it's generally more robust to kind of deal with subwords, if that makes sense, right? So like I was saying before, if you have the word playing, you want to have the word ing understood as an action, if that makes sense, right? Because this is a subword that means quite a lot in the English language, right? So if AI can kind of see things like ing or un, it can kind of start to understand what those component or subwords actually mean, right? And so it's just, they found that it's essentially a lot more efficient to operate at the subword level. Because if you operate kind of at just the main word level, then it has to learn, for example, from scratch what the word toothpaste means. But if it can split up tooth and paste, then it's a lot easier to understand, right? Because it just knows what tooth is and then it knows what paste is. And then it can figure out that it's something like some kind of paste that you put on a tooth, right? And so subwords have a lot richer meaning in English context, in kind of English characters. But for example, like tokens don't work for like Chinese, right? Because for Chinese, a lot of characters it's just single characters, right? And so you can't really tokenize characters if you think about it, right? Like how do you break up a character into subwords or sub-characters, right? And so yeah, so AI has kind of learned, at least for the English language, that it's a lot better to kind of use these subwords to understand different parts of the word. Yeah.
Also, on like the next slide, I think you showed like a diagram showing how AI will look at like a passage differently to humans.
Yeah.
Would the natural progression to get AI to read those passages as more similar to the way humans do?
Is that this one here?
Yeah,
yeah.
on that.
Or yeah, so like they've kind of experimented with that and they found that the answer was no. So humans kind of read this in a certain way. So for example, like, I don't know, at least for me, for example, I read like eighth together as a word and ninth together as a word, but AI actually breaks down the TH into separate things, right? Because the TH is again like a subword that means something, right? Like you can use it for like seventh or fifth or fourth or whatever. And so when it kind of sees that, it knows that it's like potentially like a date, for example, or like a ranking of some sort, right? So it kind of sees that, yeah. And so yeah, again, like it reads it in a really strange way. I mean, like ones that kind of are weird to me is like this one. Like I don't know why it reads only as that, right? It sees it as two separate words, but I suspect it's because it's in caps, right? So it like will see this and it thinks it means something and this, right? Because when you take a look at this only, it sees it as a single word, right? So the caps, like, capitalized letters also matter as well. I mean, like this is an interesting one, like UCSF, right? This is like University of California, San Francisco. But there's like University of California, San Diego, for example. And so it sees UCS as like a single meaning, right? And it's going to know it's like a university related thing. And then that F kind of adds meaning to say that it's like San Francisco, right? Yeah. So it's kind of strange. And people have looked at this and gone like, does AI understand something about language that we don't understand, right? And there's possibilities that that could be the case, right? It just sees like different patterns to how humans have structured things. Yeah, really interesting question. Other questions? Yeah.
What's the difference between BERT and GPT? Because like to me, as
Yeah.
like a beginner, it just seems more logically to use BERT because like it looks
Sorry, could you repeat that a
it
little
looks
bit?
like BERT looks bi-directionally, right?
Yeah.
While GPT looks
Yeah.
unidirectionally.
Yeah.
Why are we using GPT?
Yeah, so this was kind of like a big question that we had in the 2020s, right? When we weren't sure, the field wasn't actually sure whether BERT or GPT was better. And so Google spent, I think, a lot of money to develop this BERT system. Okay, so I kind of didn't talk too much about this because now GPT has become ultra dominant, right? Otherwise, it kind of be called like chat BERT. But fundamentally, these have two different philosophies a little bit and how it's training using language, right? So with BERT, it uses this thing called masked language modeling. And so can you imagine, like say you have at your fingertips kind of like the whole of the internet, right? Now, how do you train AI to kind of be able to replicate the internet? So Google decided that the best way was to basically mask different words and ask the AI to predict what that word is, okay? So it would, for example, give the AI this sentence here and then ask it to predict what this word is supposed to be, right? So it sees like I, a master assistant, and it needs to figure out that this word should be I am a master assistant, right? So for example, it might master up this one, and it's got to figure out like what this is. Meanwhile, like ChatGPT decided to use this method, which in hindsight, like, is genius, but like back then it was, it was unclear whether it was actually better, which is that instead of saying that you can mask like random words like this, you can only mask the words at the end of a sentence. Okay, so for example, would like go like that, right? So, it will show the AI I, and then it's got to predict this entire sentence, right? And then it will show the AI this, and then it's got to predict the rest of the sentence. So you see how this is a lot harder to train, right? Like this is a lot more traditional because, with AI, you just basically go, oh, what's this word? It's basically like a cloze exercise in English, right? But for this one, it's asking the AI to predict the entire sentence based on this start here. So you see how that's fundamentally a lot more challenging, right? And so it actually wasn't clear whether the entirety of the internet could allow you to actually do this, or it was just kind of like a shot in the dark, right? And so if we kind of look at how these work, BERT ended up being excellent for information without direction. So for example, a classic example of BERT being really good is biological data. So a lot of biological studies still use BERT because things like genes don't have kind of a direction, right? Or, if you have kind of like RNA, like GTA, UC, or whatever, the direction doesn't really matter that much. You're just trying to predict like different bases, right? So a lot of biological models actually still use BERT, if you think about it, right? Because the model is kind of really good at predicting what that gene should be or what that gene should be, right? But the problem was that it's very slow and expensive to train, like ultra expensive. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But yeah, essentially Google just found that they were throwing a lot of money into this and realizing that it wasn't working very well, right? On the other hand, like ChatGPT, which used the GPT model, use this method called causal language modeling, which is, it just gives you that, and it's like, you got to predict this whole sentence. And they found that it was weirdly excellent for language, right? Because language, when you say something, it depends on what you previously said, right? Like when you try and say a sentence, it always is dependent on what you previously said in the last sentence, right? When you try and say a word in a sentence, it really matters what you just said in that sentence. And so they found that it was a lot easier and cheaper to train, right? And so therefore you could get really complex behavior out of it, right? And I usually kind of have a slide, but I decided not to put it in, whereby you can ask ChatGPT, what is, this rare disease like opsoclonus myoclonus or something, right? The fact that it can answer that means that it understands entirely what the question is, what the disease is, how to explain the disease. And so this kind of method is very, very powerful for that. Yeah. Yeah, but you're like, back in 2020, like it would not be the same conclusion. People will be like, I don't know which one's better, right? And you just got to experiment and throw like $1 billion in and see what comes out, kind of thing, right? And that's kind of what happened. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to know about I know there's a probability of calculating the weight based on given the. Is that, I want to ask, is that we're given only the word that in the front of the masking word, or the whole branch of the sentence we're given in this situation to predict the weight?
Yeah. So sorry, this is not actually weight, but I think it's word.
Okay,
but this one,
okay,
right?
yeah.
And so it's just kind of like, given the word the, what should the next word be?
Yeah.
Right. And so like for this case, it'll be like the nice, and then it will be like, okay, what's the next word given the nice, right? And it could be like dog, right? And then it'll be like, what's the next word given the nice dog? And it just runs that over and over again until it generates like a sentence, right? And then based on that, it'll keep on generating words. So when you use ChatGPT, a couple of years ago, you could actually see it literally generate each word. Do you know what I mean? Like now it's so fast that you kind of just see a whole sentence, right? But back then you could literally see like, oh, the nice dog like did this, right? And what's kind of interesting is that ChatGPT doesn't always select the highest probability one, right? So it will randomly select like, it will literally randomly select like one of these, if that makes sense, with greater probability if it's here. So it's all based on probabilities, right? So even if like, you have this, say nice is like 20%, nice will only appear 20% of the time, right? If dog is like 10%, it will appear 10% of the time. So it actually doesn't always go for the most perfect thing. And that's a parameter that we call temperature, which is how random is it selecting this, right? And so one of the kind of experiments we were doing last year is if you decrease the temperature of the model, how good is it for medicine, right? Like if you, for example, like always choose this, right? Does it do better for medicine? Because if you kind of choose randomly, what ended up happening a little bit was that it would hallucinate, right? Because it would, say like you ask it a medical question and the medical answer is kind of here, it would more randomly choose these ones here and kind of spit out like nonsense, right? If you, for example, increase the temperature really high back then, it would just spit out like complete nonsense, right? Like as in like words that made absolutely no sense. Like it's not even a sentence kind of thing. So kind of very interesting that, yeah, like it doesn't choose that. What they found as well was when they always chose this word here, it was very boring, right? If you ask it to write it a short story, it would write the exact same thing every time, right? And people didn't like that either. And so it actually is a little bit more random. And yeah, I think initially they always did like, the very first one and no one wanted to use it, right? Because it just kept on answering the same thing every time, right? So kind of very interesting. Other questions? Yeah.
Professor, I have a second question about the topic you're talking about, like overfitting, like only use the most the highest probability one versus the lowest probability one.
Yeah.
So in the under or overfitting part, is that associated with accuracy, and the accuracy of this is something like sorry, like will be like true positive or like false positive, like it's not always true about
Language, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And should we always would be better to choose the best option with this?
Yeah. So I mean, firstly, the concept of false positive and false negative, it doesn't really exist for language, right? Because language is a lot more subjective, right? And so it becomes a question of like how creative should the model be, right? Which was what we were initially working with, and I think still working with to some degree, which is when they decrease the temperature, so that is it would always choose this first one, right? It did really well for factual things. It like did really well for like kind of good facts, right? So for example, like medicine or science, or when you're asking it something from Wikipedia, it would do very well. But it did really poorly for like anything creative or subjective. And if you increase the temperature, so it chooses more of these like long tail ones here, like these ones here, it did really poorly for facts, right? Because it would kind of just choose like words that were less likely to be seen, right? But it did really great for creativity. So a big kind of challenge that OpenAI had back then was how creative should it be, right? Or how factual should it be? Like, how do you think you should solve that? Like, should you just kind of go in the middle somewhere, and make no one happy? Or like, how would you kind of solve that if, say, it was you, right? And this was a serious question like last year, right? So this is not like 10 years ago or something, right? They were trying to figure out how creative or how factual the model should be. What do you guys think? Yes, it depends on the situation. So they realized that if the question is about facts, then they should decrease the temperature, right? And if it's about something creative, like create me an image or write an essay or something, then it would increase the temperature, right? Yeah.
So quick question about word embedding.
Yeah.
Is there like many different kind of libraries depending on the context given? So if we're like talking about fruits, an apple would be a fruit.
Yeah. So initially, yes, absolutely. So if you recall, so word embeddings are essentially when you put language in mathematical coordinates, right?
Yeah.
So if you recall kind of this basic thing, man and woman is the same coordinates as like king, like coordinate difference as like king and queen, right? So initially people created a bunch of word embedding libraries, right? So this is like 2012, 2013, we were like, someone like created like a scientific word embedding library. So it's just scientific words, right? Someone created one for like medical stuff. So just medical words, right? But then they realized that, language itself, it's quite broad, right? Like you need to have everything, right? And so people started to create corpuses for like every word in the English dictionary, and then like in the French one, in the Spanish one, to see if you could learn from different languages, right? But what they missed was that the meaning of the word is very heavily dependent on other words around it, right? Which is where attention came in. So, like this example here, right? Like if you have like turn on the light, light means just something different there, right? Like it's a physical switch that you can turn on, right? Versus light on your feet, it means something else. The word light there means that you're light, like kind of airy and light, right? And so, yeah, so that was kind of a huge realization for, and actually pretty much the main kind of realization for ChatGPT was that language needed to be dynamic, right? So that is depending on the sentence that you're seeing around the word, the meaning of the word has to be modified. It has to be kind of pulled in some other direction mathematically, right? Just in coordinate space. Yeah. Yeah.
So you have one that's like already there, and then
Yeah.
during the conversation, it dynamically changes.
Yes, exactly. So for example, you ask it, let me see, like, I don't know, yeah, like,
No, I
yeah,
understand
yeah.
the example. Just like I
Yeah.
thought it would be like maybe many of these
Yeah.
with like light being in a different place and it changes libraries instead of changing the library.
Yes.
But
Yeah. So all the words constantly are changing now, right? If you ask about like, I don't know, Trump in 1990, right? Like the fact that you asked about 1990 means that now Trump is pulled towards like real estate, right? But you asked about Trump in 2016, right? The fact that you have the word 2016 there means that it's pulled towards being a president, right? Yeah, so that's kind of the main realization they had, and that's it's pretty cool, right? And it's pretty cool how simple it is as well, right? Like it's just, in hindsight, it looks very simple that they should have thought of that, but it took us years and years, right, for us to figure out that that was important. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?